Hey kids, welcome to part 3 of our unit on how the government works. Last time we talked about the Constitution and how it was created. This time we're talking about the legislative branch and how they do. So just say no to drugs and say yes to knowledge, because this is an intervention of learning. It's only because I care. Essential question. What is the role of the legislative branch, and how do they create the laws of our country? As we learned in our last video, the Constitution creates a bicameral, or two-house legislature that creates the laws for our country. We refer to both houses together as Congress. The two houses or groups in Congress are the House of Representatives and the Senate. So what do the House and Senate do, and how does someone become a member of Congress? The House of Representatives has 435 members, which are appointed or divided up between the states based on population. But how do they decide how many representatives each state gets? Well, the Constitution states that every 10 years the country must hold a census where every American is counted. Once the population of the United States is known, the 435 members are assigned, with the largest states getting the most members and the small states getting the least. Every state gets at least one member. Remember when we talked about the Electoral College in our last unit? If you look closely at the numbers, you will see that Oregon and California have 2 less members in the House of Representatives than they do in the Electoral College. This is because the Electoral College adds the 2 senators that each state gets to their number of House members to see how many votes they get in the Electoral College. Members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. They have to be at least 25 years old, live in the state they represent, and be a citizen of the U.S. for at least 7 years. House members represent a specific area of their state called a district and are elected by the people in their district. Now, senators, on the other hand, serve 6-year terms, but only a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So even though the entire House of Representatives could be replaced every 2 years, it would take a full 6 years to change the entire Senate, and it could only be done 1/3 at a time. To run for office in the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old, live in the state you represent, and have been a citizen of the U.S. for at least 9 years. Senators represent the entire state and are elected by a statewide vote, as opposed to having a district. The House and Senate have similar jobs, which is to create laws. The differences between the two groups can best be seen by looking at how a bill becomes a law. So, what is a bill? Well, simply put, a bill is a solution to a problem. Anyone can come up with an idea for a bill, but only a member of Congress can submit it for consideration. A bill can become a law only if it makes it through the following steps. Step 1. The bill must be submitted to Congress. Bills can start in either the House or the Senate. However, if it's a revenue bill, it must start in the House. Once it's been submitted to Congress, it's assigned to a committee. Committees are groups of representatives or senators, because there's committees on both houses of Congress, that consider bills that relate to a certain part of government. For example, there's a budget committee that only thinks about things that do with money. Energy committee that has to do with how we should create our energy in our country. Education, of course, about schools. Committees decide if a bill is worth the time to be considered by the rest of Congress. This is the first place a bill can die. If the committee thinks the bill is a good idea, it reports out, but first it has to decide if they like it or not. They do this by reading the bill, talking about it, holding hearings. This is time for people that are for or against the bill to come and testify or talk to them about it. Then they finally vote on it. If the majority of the committee thinks the bill is good, it reports it out to the rest of Congress. Of course, if not, like I said earlier, then it dies. Up next is floor action. This is when the bill becomes the star on the floor of the House or Senate. So floor action is when the bill gets put in the spotlight for everyone to consider. Floor action is different in the Senate than it is in the House. In the House, floor action includes going before the Rules Committee, whose job it is to make sure that there are limits to how long people can talk about and what changes can be made to the bill. Of course, in the House, we have 435 members. There's a lot more people to be talking. In the Senate, with only 100 members, there are no restrictions on changes to the bills or time limit on talking about them, which is where the filibuster comes from. The filibuster is when a senator can actually talk forever. And the only thing that would stop them would be to get 60 members out of 100 instead of 50 to vote to have him stop talking. Floor action also includes debate and possible amendments or changes to the bill. Once discussion of the bill is over, the vote is taken. If the majority say yes, the bill passes. If the majority says no, then the bill dies. But sometimes the House passes a different bill than the Senate, or vice versa. If this happens, there has to be what's called a conference committee. That means that the House sends a group of people and the Senate sends a group of people to meet together. And they together create one bill that has something of what they both like in it, called a compromise bill. Once they both compromise, they send it back to floor action in both houses for a final vote. After both houses in Congress have approved the bill, it goes to the president. And the president can choose to sign it, which means it becomes a law, or veto it, which doesn't necessarily mean it becomes a law. If the president vetoes the bill, it goes back to the House and Senate. If 2/3 of the House and Senate vote to override the veto, then it still becomes law. If they don't, you guessed it, the bill dies. So as we saw when looking at the process of how a bill becomes a law, cooperation between the president and Congress is usually necessary to create laws. It's not enough to have Congress simply pass a law. The president also has to agree and sign it. This requirement of cooperation between different parts of government is called checks and balances. So why do we have checks and balances? Remember, in our video about the Constitutional Convention, the way to give government power without losing rights was to limit the power of government. The way the Founding Fathers did this was through taking the power of government and dividing it up between Congress, the President, and the judicial system. The system is called the separation of powers. Now, dividing up power between different groups of people only helps if the power stays divided. In other words, separation of powers does nothing if the President comes in and decides to dissolve the Congress and abolish the court system. To prevent one group of persons from taking all the power, the Founding Fathers created checks and balances. The system gives each group some power over the other in order to keep the powers separated. For example, Congress just can't pass whatever laws it wants to. It has to have the president's signature or a supermajority of Congress to override the president's veto. At the same time, the president can't do whatever he wants because if he or she breaks the law or violates the Constitution, Congress can kick him out of office. The Chief Justice, which is the highest authority in the judicial branch, acts as judge in the trial if the president breaks law. At the same time, the president gets to choose the members of the Supreme Court when members retire. Here is a diagram showing most of the checks and balances, in case you're curious about the rest of them. So what? Well, if you can answer the following questions, then you'll learn what you needed to know. Compare and contrast the differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. How does a bill become a law? Feel free to use a diagram to show your answer. What are checks and balances and how are they related to the separation of powers? Tune in next time to find out about the executive branch and exactly what it is they execute.